All right, so hello everybody. We're about to start now. So if you're here, please turn on your cameras. And also, yeah, I noticed some of you have forgotten about the spreadsheet that you need to sign in. And so uh, please do that as well. And you might actually sign yourself up for classes that you forgot to include. So I actually have the roster of people who attend the Zoom meetings. So it's not a problem. So I could double check, but just better to have everything in one place. Anyhow, so we are continuing to talk again about experiments today. So let me stop sharing the screen. So where is PowerPoint? There we go. Okay, so today,
in which we will delve into more details about experimental design. Right? But before that, I want with you to go, and we've done part of this last time. So just new hypotheses, and then we see how you're going to create groups out of these hypotheses, right? So let's say hypothesis one, participant who view a news story with a negative ending will be able to recall more story items than those who view a story with a positive ending or a neutral ending. So just quickly, how many groups we have if we're doing experiments on hypothesis one? How many groups we would have? You can answer in the chat, by the way, if you prefer. What do you think? Read it again. Participants who view a news story with a negative ending will be able to recall more story items than those who view a story with a positive ending or a neutral ending. Okay, Julian says 2. What do you guys say? Right, yeah, okay, yeah, right. So it's 3. So negative, positive, or neutral. All right. Students who have a friendly instructor in class will express greater level of engagement than students who have a socially distant instructor in another speech class section. I think this one is easier. How many groups we could have in the experiment? Yeah, right. So here just 2. Students in a small class will have a higher communication apprehension from the instructor, and this effect will be more pronounced if the instructor was female. So this is we'll pick this one by one. And so yeah, so hypothesis one, we said we could have 3 conditions based on news story ending. Hypothesis 3 is proposing something different. It's saying that the communication apprehension will be affected by being in a small class or not, and more of that, so the effect will be compounded if the instructor was female. So what hypothesis 3 is saying, so imagine we want to convert that into an experiment. We want to do an experiment on that hypothesis. So we have one factor, which is class size, right? And then the second factor would be the gender of the instructor. And so how many categories we have in each factor, factor 1 and factor 2? How many categories we have? So within factor 1, how many categories we have?
2.
Okay. And within factor 2, how many categories we have?
2.
All right. So in factor 1, you have 2. In factor means independent variable, by the way. So in factor 1, you have 2. Factor 2, you have 2. So you end up with a 2 by 2 experimental design. So how many groups in total we will end up with?
4.
Can you list them, please? Can anyone list them? So 4 groups, that's correct. And they will be what?
Large or small, male, female.
Well, give me more specific. Large what?
Small.
No, you have a large class. Actually, you would have an instructor in 4 groups, right? So the one with the large class size, it would have an instructor, right? And that instructor will be what?
Female.
Right.
Or
And then, okay. And then condition 2, the instructor would be what?
either female or male. Yeah.
All right, so yeah. So we're having a large class with a male instructor, large class with a female instructor, small class with a male instructor, small class with a female instructor, right? So whenever you see 2 by 2, that's for condition, and so you combine, like it's multiply. It's not a combination actually. You multiply, right? So it's not small, large, male, female. It's actually small with male, small with female, large with female, large with male, right? So that's when you read those experiments, like by reading the hypothesis, actually, you could figure out how many conditions the experiment ought to have, right? Because you want to test and not only the effects of one variable, but the effects of like 2 variables together, right? Because here it's saying if this effect will be more pronounced if the instructor was female, right? So small classes are better, but then if you look at small classes with a male instructor versus a female instructor, the one with the female instructor would even be better than for communication apprehension, right? Those are made up examples, right? So don't take this at that has any value. Just those hypotheses are just made up for instruction purposes, right? So that what we just said, when you're having 2 factors interacting with one another to produce an effect, we call that an interaction effect, right? So when you read that in a paper with someone talking about it, interaction effect, meaning it's like 2 factors are the one that are going to affect the dependent variable or whatever outcome you're studying, right? So in this case, in the example I gave from hypothesis 3, it's saying, okay, class size would affect communication apprehension. So the larger the class is, the less communication apprehension the students would have. So is this a negative or a positive correlation, by the way? Large class size, less apprehension. It's negative or a positive relationship?
Negative.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, so good. Just checking if people are remembering things, right? So yeah, so that's one, and then the second thing is saying the instructor would affect the students in like communication apprehension as well. And so when you have the 2, so that's the interaction effect. You're saying a class size with a female instructor would increase students' apprehension, right? So that's what interaction effects mean, right? Okay. Also, you might hear that. So in terms of like effects, you could also hear it will be referred to as the moderator, that the gender of the instructor moderate the effect of class size on communication apprehension. And what that means is that when you say something is a moderator, it doesn't mean that by itself will produce a significant results, a significant outcome, but when it's combined with another factor, it would produce a stronger effect, right? So here, for instance, you might have in an experiment that the instructor gender did not matter but on and by itself. But when you combine the instructor gender with the class size, you actually saw like a clear effect. So if you take, for example, here, like classes taught by males and classes taught by females have no difference in terms of students' apprehension, but small classes taught by females are better than small classes taught by males, right? So the gender moderated the effect of the class size. The class size is still the main factor, but the gender was just like an added layer that actually either like boosted the effects, right? So that's the what we mean by moderating effect. A quick question. So if we're studying this, is it better to observe those effects in the real world, or should we create a new experimentation groups to test this hypothesis? Which method would allow us to test this hypothesis more precisely? Experiment or just a real world observation? What do you think?
Observation.
And why is that?
Because I mean, you can observe already the class setting, like what's exemplified in the path 1, path 2, or path 3. Like you wouldn't have to create a new setting for it because it's already established.
Right. So you better save yourself a lot of efforts and money, because we have so many naturally occurring conditions in the real world. And so you could observe small classes with males and small classes with females and vice versa without the need to create experimental conditions. But what would be the limitations of that, of the approach Raymond has suggested, based off what we've studied so far in this class? What would be the issue if we observe naturally occurring groups? Remember the example about the people who would play FIFA and the people who would play, what is it, Call of Duty? Remember that example we gave? Will you be assigned to a group or choose your own group? Nobody. Remember the example about music? Like which music is better for studying?
Yeah, I was gonna say like voluntary bias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, could you elaborate? How would that affect this specific hypothesis?
Like students who prefer smaller class sizes are gonna attend class sizes that are inherently smaller, and then students that prefer like larger class sizes are gonna go to larger classes.
Right. And the same thing applies for the gender, right? So if students prefer a female professor or male professor, they're also going to sign up for the sections taught by whatever type of instructor they prefer. And so what, especially for this one, so what you're going to see is that, for instance, students who prefer small classes, actually, you could argue that they prefer closer interaction with the instructor, right? And students who prefer large classes actually don't want any interaction, and they just want to sign up for a class, get the 3 credits, and they don't like the instructor to bother them in the classroom. So what you're going to see then, if you test the effects in the real world, that's going to match, because people who are already more attentive signed up for the small class size, right? Small size class. And so what you're going to see is that, yeah, as selection bias, as Jared has said, right? people who were already more like attentive and more interactive would sign up for small classes, which gonna show you an effect if you do comparisons between groups. But that doesn't validate causality, right? Because the effect could be the other way around. So, yeah. Which then lead us to talk about challenges into when we do experiments and why there are many things we need to be aware of when we conduct experiments. So now we're going to talk about challenges. The main thing is about challenges. So yeah, challenges that you're going to face if you are about to run an experiment or conduct experimental research. The first one is like finding a theoretical framework or like showing correlations or associations without a theoretical framework between your variables. And so what we mentioned before, if you remember, we said what a theory is. A theory is not something that tells you X causes Y or X is related to Y, but it tells you how X is related to Y or how does X affect Y, right? It makes sense. It explains the mechanism by which the independent variable or the predictor would affect the dependent variable or the outcome, right? So it has to make sense within like a theoretical or philosophical or logical framework, right? And so with experiments, you must explain what theory is being tested and how that theory is empirically, so empirically means in a test, like actually remember what we already spent the whole week on empirical, so something that is observable and verifiable, like, yeah, how you experimentally linking the effects to the theory, okay? And so to give an example, say that you find using media multitasking is associated with increased eating of unhealthy snacks as opposed to healthy snacks, right? So when people engage in multitasking or media multitasking, so you're playing in your phone and watching TV, and maybe even watching something or even maybe playing something in the background of your laptop, right? Or like watching something on Netflix or working on your homework, something like that, right? That will increase the tendency for unhealthy snacks as opposed to healthy snacks. So assuming you found the link, but what's the theory behind that? Could someone guess? If you do more media multitasking, you would feel the urge to eat something unhealthy. Can someone think of any link whatsoever between the two things? Any ideas?
Something like relaxation, like you're like streaming multiple like things on your tablet and stuff, and you're kind of just like relaxing.
Yeah, right. So we call that like a mental load or cognitive load. So the thing is, because say you're watching something on Netflix and also texting, and maybe there's another tab, there's a homework, and so it's too much mental load in which you want something to escape. And what's a better escape than like binge eating? So you won't think about let me just cook or like steam some broccoli with like steamed rice and eat. No, you'll just think about like anything that's fully satisfactory for your palate, right? So unhealthy snacks, so like chips, like nachos, you name it, popcorn, etc., right? Well, popcorn is not that unhealthy, but yeah, that's the point. That's the point. Yeah, so the idea is you could draw some psychological associations. And so you can then draw from research about when people under like a lot of like thinking pressure or something like that that would affect their eating habits. That's what we mean by a theory, right? So it makes sense. Like psychologically, okay, you could make sense. And some of you mentioned an example like if horror movies as opposed to comedies increase appetite or suppress appetite. And the idea is that, yeah, if you want an escape, horror movies could lead you just to eat more. And some mentioned that, okay, actually comedy, if you're more relaxed, you actually, yeah, you would mindlessly like eat, right? And so it could be both, right? But the idea, like there is some logically coherent hypothesis that's being tested. And so the practice of just trying to figure out any two things that correlate and call it like a research finding, that's called data dredging or p-hacking sometimes. So data dredging is when you have two like arbitrary variables and you find like a statistically significant link between them, but you cannot explain what's the logic behind that, right? So for example, like the one here, like unicyclists are more likely to win the lottery. How does being a unicyclist affect your chance of winning the lottery? What's like the logical sequence of X leading to Y? Well, the answer is that well, probably there's none. But the idea is that you could look at the universe, and we mentioned that before, and you would find two variables that are connected. Right? It's not really that hard to find two things that just by chance correlate strongly. But that doesn't mean they are actually you have a theory unless there's some logical explanation, right? And here, for example, like in this cartoon, people who did not have a stroke were more likely to drink soy lattes on Tuesday. I mean, yeah, but how does if you could explain then green tea daily? Okay. So yeah, if you could explain the relationship between soy lattes and strokes, then you have a hypothesis, like anything about the chemicals. If not, if just a random observation, then it's not really a theory, right? So that's one, and you would see, for example, and think about it when you suggest your group project, like how exactly can you explain what the hypothesis is trying to establish, right? Like something that could be explained theoretically, logically, and philosophically. So that's first. Second, and it's about creating the experimentation itself, which is that the stimuli must represent the independent variable more than anything else. And so this is about how we create materials for the experiment. And so when you're generating the stimuli materials for condition 1 or condition 2, condition 3, even if you have 3, how exactly, like what elements you're going to include in those stimuli? Let me give you an example. So this was like from past research. So actually my colleague, Professor Bradley Bond, if you know him, he actually does research on LGBT characters in the media. So let's say, for example, a hypothesis is, so exposure to LGBT characters in TV drama affect participants' views on gay equality, right? So you see gay characters, you became more receptive to gay equality or LGBT equality. So, and so the experiment's okay, let's say it's simple. So you include inclusion of visibly gay characters, and the control condition is no visibly gay characters in the drama, right? So far, so good. The question is how to ensure that the character is visibly gay, right? So what does visibly gay mean, practically speaking, in the experiment itself? Okay, you say visibly gay. Okay, what does that mean, right? So does that mean like explicit reference? Like someone saying, oh, like a guy, let's say a man saying, yeah, I'm going with my husband to blah, blah, blah. Or like you show them like in a gay wedding, or like you show them like sitting in a gay bar, or like maybe wearing something like gay pride or something. Like how would we make it visibly gay? So that's the question, right? um and so yeah, the idea of like if you're testing that in an experiment, you have to make sure that the audiences perceive the materials as you intended, right? So that's like you need to think about what things would represent being visibly gay in this case, right? Which then lead me to talk about something unique to communication experiments, which is to say sometimes the factors we manipulate are different. So I'm going to invite you to read these two lists, those short lists on the slide. And could you tell me what's the difference between list A and list B on the screen? So read list A first and then read list B and tell me what's the difference between those two things or those two attributes. Anyone? So what's common with those attributes in here versus those attributes? The other one. How is list A different than list B? Any ideas? You're doing experiments. How dealing with those two be different?
I think it's like I on activity 6, there's like a question about like the psychological like factors versus I forgot what the
message attributes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, list B would be a psychological type of variable, and then list A would be the other one. I forgot.
So yeah, correct. So list B is what we call perception attributes or psychological attributes, and this is about message. Okay, and let me explain. So if you go over them, so long commercials, that's something you could do easily. So just 30 seconds versus 5 minutes. Okay, so it's something that you can directly manipulate. It's tangible. Black and white pictures. Can you create black and white pictures? Easy, right? Red color packaging. Can you create that easily? Right. High definition videos, right? Again, like we know there's an agreed upon standard for like high definition. If you play 1080 pixel video versus 360 pixel video, okay? And or like recruiting African American actors. So yeah, this is somewhat technically this could be also because I would say black actor would be better because might not know is like if they're African American or like British American or from Ghana, like, but just as a matter of like, okay, I can have like a Caucasian person, a Black person, and like an Asian person, right? So it's something that's visibly clear, and it doesn't involve, or it involves less interpretation by the audiences, right? Something about the message itself, okay, the content itself. Whereas when we say violent video game or threatening, okay, violent here, is it more subjective or objective? Or is it more relative to the participant or not, or just absolute?
It's more relative.
Right. So yeah, so if you look at all of the items in list B, so violent video game, threatening. So what's threatening to me could be different than what's threatening to Grant, right? Like sex appeal at. Well, also there's some subjectivity or like interpretive element to it. Thin ideal model, okay, uplifting music, and on, like a depressing film, like joyful character, humorous ad. You can think on and on and on. So those things are actually, yeah, that's something that we call like having different attributes. So in an example, how we do it. So so this is from a research, this is from an actual experiment, by the way. So more humorous commercial results in greater product appeal and greater purchase intention than less humorous commercial, okay? So more humorous, less humorous, okay? Those are the two conditions. How did the researcher experimented with that? How did they manipulate the condition? And so they said, okay, so participants saw either humorous animated commercials, that's condition A. Condition B, same commercial with the punchline removed. Okay, so the version B were the same commercial, but they removed the punchline, so the ad would be less humorous. Okay, so at least that's the method or the approach by those researchers, right? And so the idea came because you didn't get the full joke. So the first part, okay, you still got the music and maybe like there's something humorous about it, but you didn't get the full joke. So it reduced the level of perceived humorousness, okay, humorousness, okay, or humor. And so yeah, so that's something you see when you're dealing with something like this. You need to be, you'll become more creative to like creating two different versions, right? And so yeah, and so that's what we're talking about in hypotheses. Sometimes you're actually talking about your independent variable is actually about the psychological reaction or the psychological perception, which will then lead to affect the dependent variable, right? So what you're having is actually, you're having audio visual attributes. So something about the length, something about the characters you include in the scene, something about the packaging, the colors, the size, the length of like the type of letters you include, etc., right? Like visual, audio visual attributes, would then lead to like a perceived attribute or like psychological attributes, which is your independent variable. And then that would affect the dependent variable, right? So if we saw in the previous example, they say more humorous means higher purchase intention by the consumer. And so, but they needed to affect or change the audio visual attributes of the message first. So they cut it in length, which made it less humorous, which then produced that the ad became less effective in changing purchase intention of consumers, right? And so this is very key when you read experimental design. And that is to say that the link between the message attributes, which is this link right here, and the psychological reaction must be established before we even look at the hypothesis testing. all right? In other words, we have to know that the experimentation itself worked as intended before we even delve into if they were effective in changing the dependent variable or the different outcomes, right? So in other words, right here, were the researchers successful in making condition B perceived as less humorous, okay? And so this is from the paper. So the researcher must conduct something you call manipulation check. And this is very important. That manipulation check is a question by which the authors check if the conditions if the groups represent the same conditions that the authors intended. So in other words, in this example, condition A was indeed more humorous and condition B was indeed less humorous. And so in this paper, participants were asked in the post-test to give evaluation of how much each of the commercial possessed these characteristics. And they asked if they were amusing, depressing, funny, imaginative, entertaining on an 11-point scale ranging from 0 to 10, right? And so the idea is the average level of funniness, right? So let's say here, funny. So for condition A, it should be, oops, sorry about that. For condition A, should be higher than condition B, right? So if the two condition, by the way, let me ask you a question. If the two conditions were equal in terms of their perceived funniness, okay? If they were equal, that means the experiment is what? If they found that condition B was no different than condition A in funniness or humorousness, that means the whole experiment is can they proceed to test the hypothesis of the two conditions were equal in being funny? Yeah, Grant. No. Grant, can you tell us why not? What's the problem?
Well, I guess it would be that they didn't. I don't know. I would think because. Oh man, I'm not sure.
Oh yeah. Like, so the point is, any ideas? If condition A is equal to condition B in being humorous, can you actually test the hypothesis? Just as practically speaking. Like, yeah. Julian, do you know why? Why can't we test the hypothesis?
If they're both equal, I guess just because you won't really observe any like meaningful results if they're both equal, like you're just gonna keep getting the same thing.
Right. So that means the experiment has failed, basically, before we even proceed to testing any hypothesis, because your manipulation failed. You were not able to create a condition in which the participant felt more funniness or felt the joke is better than the other condition. So that means all the participants, practically speaking, were in the same condition. They were in one condition because there was no difference between the two. And so if the manipulation check fails, the whole experiment falls apart, right? And you can think of all the examples in this list, list B. Sorry, let me go back. Yeah, right here. So if we are testing the effects of violent video games, and in condition A, condition B thought the game was equally violent, or like the effects of threatening messages. So condition A, condition B thought the message was equally threatening. Then that means, yeah, your whole experiment failed, right? like condition A was not different than condition B in the independent variable, right? Before we even proceed to the dependent variable, right? So then, yeah, when the whole experiment, when the manipulation itself fails, the whole experiment fails without even the need to proceed to any other test, right? And so this is in experimentation. This is the most crucial step. The most crucial steps is when you say we tested the effect of violent video games versus non-violent video games. You have to establish that indeed violent video games condition was actually more violent than in the non-violent condition, right? So it's these labels we add, but we have to make sure that the audiences feel the same way, right? Okay. And so, yeah, so manipulation check are like questions that ask participants if they indeed perceive the characteristic of the message stimuli as intended. One example, like from my own research, is that Instagrammers who are perceived as fashion bloggers increase interest in the featured brand. So if you think this is a fashion blogger, you would trust the products they endorse. And so a manipulation check will be simply saying, okay, how do you perceive the person you see in the picture? And if people say like a fashion blogger, then my, at least at this step, my manipulation worked. And then I could test if that affect the brand attitude or not. So you get the point. To establish that the two conditions are perceived as intended, then test the hypothesis, right? Let's do number 4, which is relevant. And so, which is like what we call treatment confound, which is relevant to what we've been talking about. Like it's when a variable, other than the intended variables, varies by the manipulation and ultimately change the outcome variable. So in other words, in your experiment, condition A changed one thing, but it also changed another thing. And condition B, the same. All right? This is very vague and abstract. Let me give you an example, right? And I can give you multiple examples, right? And so when we're working with messages, whatever something you manipulate will ultimately lead to change something else. So let me give you here an example. You're testing the effects of horror versus comedy movies on appetite. So now I'm going to show one group a comedy film and another group a horror film. So aside from the genre, what would be different between the two movies? So the genre is different. What else would be different if you're watching two movies? You're watching two different films. They would have different idea.
They would definitely invoke like different emotions. Like horror, you become fearful, and comedy, or like
No, forget about the emotions. Just about the film production. Okay, I'm getting it. About the film production, what would be different? You'll have different what?
Different actors, stories.
Right. Yeah. You go on, like actors, stories, directors, angles, cameras, like filter, lighting, costumes, set, interior design, all of that, all of the elements of film will be different, right? So they are truly indeed different in the intended psychological perception, horror versus comedy, but they are also different in every other thing. Every other, literally every other element in those two films would be different. Why is that a problem? Well, the issue is, can you then attribute the effects on the dependent variable to the difference in genre or to the difference between any of the two other elements? So in other words, It's not about the genre that affects the appetite. It's like about maybe if the characters were eating or not, or like if the characters looked happy or not, or if they looked fat or fit, or if they were in a group or individual. Well, you could go on and on and on, right? Like there are multiple variables you could suggest that affected the results. We call that confound variable, right? We call that confound. So we're going to pause here, right? And thank you, Miley. Yeah, different actors sitting. Yeah. So we're going to pause here, and those questions I'll post a video to Panopto about them, like a short 5-minute video, hopefully, and you will answer like which question about them. Do you have any questions?